right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Adrian Sanabria, host of the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast and principal researcher at the Defenders Initiative. Welcome to this webcast sponsored by Menlo Security. Today, I'm talking with, I've got two folks with me. I've got Ryan Costello, EUC engineering lead at Google Cloud. How you doing, Ryan?
Doing pretty well.
And we also have Mr. Andrew Harding, VP of Security Strategy at Menlo Security with us. How are you doing, Andrew?
Good, Adrian. Good to talk to you.
Likewise, excited about today's conversation. Today, we're discussing breaking free from legacy VDI. And if you have a question during this webcast, please select the Q&A button below. Among those 5 blue buttons, I want to also draw your attention to the chat button, which is all the way on the left. If you ask questions there, I'll be checking that periodically. So we'll answer your questions from there as well. And the Q&A button is right there in the middle. And just to the right of that Q&A button is the handouts button. And we've got 3 handouts that you can download there as well. So be sure to check out those handouts and download them. All right. So jumping into things here, VDI has a long history. We've just been talking about the staying power of VDI and other old technologies. I think oftentimes when we read about the latest in AI and everything that's going on, it's easy to forget that a lot of traditional infrastructure and approaches haven't really disappeared. They've just kind of merged in with the new stuff, right? So just kind of, just building some foundation here, and just starting with you, Ryan, not as familiar with VDI as you guys are, though I've definitely used it in the past. I remember when thin clients were a big thing. Microsoft is apparently trying to bring those back. I saw from the Ignite announcement, they have a piece of hardware that runs Windows off a Windows thing in the cloud. I'm sure it's got some local firmware that probably runs Linux or something like that. But are there still a lot of traditional like RDP to a Windows VM products in use out there?
Yeah, definitely. I think VDI gets used as a blanket term sometimes, but published applications, shared session desktop, full VDI desktops. It's a range, and they're still heavily in use for sure in a lot of different industries and different organizations.
Yeah, so the compute lives somewhere else, right? Is kind of the when somebody says VDI, it's an end user using compute that lives somewhere else generally, right?
Yeah, it's if you have client server applications and you need to keep very low latency between the client side and the server side of the application, and you have a distributed workforce, it's kind of the traditional way of handling that, providing a good level of performance and predictable performance to end users and keeping all the data centralized. So it's kind of the classic use case for that, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and even it looks like several of the cloud providers have adopted this as well, as I alluded to with the new Microsoft offering that they just announced. We've seen VDI offerings in the cloud as well. But Andrew, coming to you, is this like a difference in use cases, or do you talk to a lot of people who are kind of eager to get off the maybe what we think of as legacy VDI?
Yeah, we talked to folks who are eager to get off of it, but it really depends on their use case. As Ryan was saying, there's it's a technology umbrella that goes all the way back to thin client computing in the 90s, and it was really driven by the costs of desktops. Now there are different drivers. So there's folks who are providing remote access to a hybrid workforce, and they're trying to do that sort of in a quick and dirty way, and it ends up being really complex. And those folks, they want to get off of that legacy, costly, complex approach to delivering a desktop. And VDI is just it's a 3-letter acronym that covers all that complexity. At the other end of the spectrum, there are folks who are focused on building applications, publishing those applications, and delivering them from a virtual desktop infrastructure. Those folks are using it in a totally different way, and maybe in a way that was more appropriate with its intended use. And that becomes the platform from which you deliver applications. Those folks are doing something very different. It's the folks that are struggling with the risks and the cost of using that heavyweight VDI approach when they could be using something that is more secure, presents less risk, and is at the end of the day much less costly.
Yeah. Yeah. And, coming back to you, Ryan, a lot of us spend most of our day in a web browser today, right? Like Chromebooks wouldn't be a product otherwise. They wouldn't exist as a product. And even on our phones, I think most of the apps there are effectively, like a special container of a web app in many cases, and not very different from, the version that would get delivered to your browser on a smartphone if you were to just load it there. Are you finding that browser-based solutions can really replace classic VDI in most cases? Where is that kind of line drawn there, and how should we be thinking about, adopting a more modern approach to VDI?
I think Andrew kind of hit the nail on the head with it's very use case driven. So if your organization is primarily moving towards SaaS and web-based applications, obviously that's a no-brainer. But even for classic VDI type use cases, doing endpoint management can sometimes be challenging. I did that for a long time, and having consistency between different platforms, Windows and Mac OS and iOS and Android. A lot of times with EMM platforms, it's people struggle to adopt those solutions. And it's being able to just present a browser as a delivery method for whether you're doing SaaS or web-based applications, or if you're doing app publishing or VDI, just delivering that session in a browser. If you can use the browser as a control point, it simplifies your security footprint quite a bit. And you may be doing some device management on top of that, but that is a really common approach. And so I think completely replacing VDI with a browser-based solution, that's very use case driven. That really depends on how hard your organization has leaned into moving towards modern apps. You may be in an industry though where you're forced to use some application that's sort of outside of your control. You've got some legacy client app you're required to use because you have a partner that relies on it or whatever. And so you may still have a use case for published apps or VDI desktops, but delivering them in a browser session is a really efficient way to do it across BYOD or corporate devices or whatever, and have kind of a consistent security standpoint across all of them.
We've got some really good examples of this from our customer base. Folks who work in a clinical environment, in a lab, have a fixed terminal where they've got what some might call a legacy app, but it's a classic client server application that can be delivered to the fixed terminal in their environment via VDI. But for everyone who's working remote, for the other folks who are using mostly web apps, they can be decommissioned from the VDI platform. Dramatically simplify what's happening with VDI if it's used internally in a fixed terminal environment. And then everyone who's working as sort of a cloud worker using SaaS, using web apps, if they can be decommissioned, simplifying the infrastructure you need, simplifying the licenses you have to pay for, and then redirecting that to something that is more secure, reduces the risk of phishing attacks, makes ransomware delivery just impossible, while delivering zero trust access to those web apps or even SaaS apps. That is an approach that really changes the risk profile of someone who's got VDI out there on the edge of their network. And that's important to think about, because if you look at the top 10 exploits of last year, this just came out of last week, Log4Shell and Citrix Bleed are still right there. So the benefit of just pulling back that infrastructure from the public edge and using it internally with all the controls you have on it for slicing up a network and doing segmentation and AAA on that internally, but not using it externally, can dramatically reduce risk. And it just happens that at the same time, if you're using the Menlo and Google Cloud solution, it's more cost effective too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think one of the pitfalls I've seen a lot of cases where, okay, maybe there's a few exceptions where it doesn't work. For a few employees, I don't know. We all seem old enough to remember physical software license dongles, right? Like, I don't know how much of that still exists out there, but there are some weird exceptions, but it kind of feels like throwing out the baby with the bathwater when like you avoid the cost savings, the simplicity, the configuration, ease of configuration and things like that you get just because you have some exception cases that can't use it, right? Like just because I can't buy a Chromebook for everybody doesn't mean nobody gets one, right?
I think that's the analysis that some folks need to do. Like look at where they can save costs while reducing risks. You talked about dongles. I remember a time when I needed a dongle going into a serial port, and I needed to be called back from work. I wouldn't sign into work. The modem at work would call me back. That's actually similar to a private access architecture where you replace all that VDI with sort of a more cloud native piece of software that runs in a mostly stateless fashion, and it connects back to a secure cloud. That secure cloud is where a browser runs and connects to any web application or SaaS application that you're using. So you've contained your exposure, dramatically simplified what you have to deploy, and at the same time, you're getting the benefit of that kind of it's old school, but it's classic, which is your system reaches out to a secure cloud rather than having to worry about and deal with unauthenticated requests coming from the wild internet. The only requests that come to a system, a web app that's deployed in the Google plus Menlo solution, are requests that are already authorized and have been cleansed by the Menlo cloud. So you don't have to worry as much, in addition to gaining all the simplicity.
Yeah. And it seems like so many breaches could be avoided by not having RDP open to the public internet or, management consoles open to the public internet. I just saw that Cisco yesterday sent out notification to its customers that they're seeing active exploitation against a Cisco ASA bug from 2014 that impacts the web-based interface. And we do have this kind of private access technology, this kind of ZTNA technology where you can get access to things, that are not exposed to the public internet remotely. Like we do have this technology now. We can remove that attack surface. Am I getting that right? Is that what you're what you're talking about here, Andrew?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I like to say, let's take the N out of ZTNA. Let's focus on zero trust access. I think both Google and Menlo really build things with a secure by design mentality. Got a fire truck going by. A secure by design mentality. That mentality means that you try to reduce your risk surface, make sure the application is secure, put controls in place, and don't necessarily take on all the complexity of trying to segment a network and have AAA on that private network, and then throw out all those controls as soon as folks go to the public internet. Because you can't micro-segment a network you don't control, but you can make sure that a web app that you allow access to or that you make available through a private access architecture works well and is secure because you've authenticated every request in. You've made sure that no authenticated traffic ever reaches the application, and everything that comes back from the application goes to a browser that is in a secure container versus going to a naked browser. Whether it's a managed version of Chrome or secure cloud browsing with Menlo, you don't want to be running a naked browser that is subject to the attack of responses that come back from a web app.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. And just talking about some of these use cases, Ryan, you've got a lot of experiences with VDI. I imagine like the one that I tend to hear a lot, and maybe Andrew hears this a lot too, are contractors, right? You're going to be working with somebody temporarily. They're going to have access to sensitive data. Maybe it's a developer, engineer working on code base, needs to connect into infrastructure and things like that. Locking them down into browser seems like, when I talk to a lot of my CISO friends, like that's kind of the default they go after. If they can have this kind of enterprise Chrome, this enterprise browser situation where they can really kind of lock down and control their access to data and things like that through a web browser. It seems like the easiest way to tackle this. Is that a common use case that you guys see as well? And are there other interesting use cases that we should call out here that people might be struggling with?
I definitely think that, contractors are one. I mentioned BYOD use cases earlier. Those are two of the really common ones where I see people more and more just providing a secure browser solution. It kind of goes back to that use case discussion. But usually where I always start those is because I have a lot of them that come to me that it's just, hey, we need help deploying VDI on Google. Can you help with that? And typically where I start is, well, first let's figure out, do you really need VDI? Do you have to give every user a desktop? Is that your actual requirement? Or do you just need to provide remote access to some apps? Because those are kind of different things. And sometimes you run into them where it's like, no, we've got this legacy application. It has to run in a desktop. This is the way we need to do it. It's like, okay, cool. Let's figure out how to do it securely and performantly. But a lot of times you dig into the use case and you figure out, oh, this is actually a web app anyway. We don't really need to provide a full desktop for that. Just give them a secured browser, and it's requires much less infrastructure, much less costly, typically an easier user experience for the end user. So it's very common.
Yeah, Andrew, anything to add to that on use cases that you see?
I couldn't agree more. This unmanaged use case, the idea that you can sign in and the policy that needs to be applied just follows you with the browser is a benefit that makes it unnecessary to have all these extra controls for users who will never be on your network, to have a bunch of extra controls for users who are on devices that you're not going to bother managing anyway, when you can have that policy follow them around and do things like mask and redact data all the way down to the browser, so that there are some things that just don't need to be seen by some folks, and to protect data, you can mask it or redact it, do that by policy, by identity. And then you can also just remind folks with watermarking, because a lot of the insider threat that we talk about is an accident. It's not a hooded hacker who's an employee. It happens, but not always. It's just an accident. Someone is careless, and if you can watermark data all the way down to the browser, then folks can be reminded, hey, this is critical data, be careful with it. And then if the browser has controls to help them be careful, if you can put DLP, data leakage protection, into your architecture, things you just can't do if you're just pushing pixels in a desktop to the edge. But if you're really processing the content that goes down, analyzing it in the cloud with an AI-driven system that makes sure that the worker gets what they want to do their job and nothing more, you can get much greater benefit than, I think Ryan just nailed it here, than using the old tool that maybe was employed for a totally different use case just because it's been there for 20 years. The tool we have now that really works are browsers, web applications, SaaS services. Most users are doing most of their work there now. So let's use the tool that's right to secure that access and do it in a way that's more cost effective, so we have budget left for additional defenses, because the threat landscape has really changed. Even though we have management consoles that are open to the public these days, or open to the public internet these days, a lot of folks have done a lot of great work managing those vulnerabilities and try to either pull things back from the public edge or take care of those systems that are at the edge. That's caused threat actors to move to the browser. A naked browser is the thing they're going after. We've seen a almost 200% increase in attacks on naked browsers, whether it's going after a vulnerability in the browser or delivering malicious content to the browser. These attacks need to be addressed now, but we have to make room for the budget to get the defenses to stop those attacks. And by taking the old tools, setting them aside, and doing the lean thing that'll make access work securely, we can make budget for these additional defenses.
Yeah. And then just, I want to talk a bit about the actual workflow process, the actual change in friction here, right? Like I still know a lot of people who, before they can get into a secure enclave or something like that, you've got to establish the VPN connection, and that's maybe one or two different sets of credentials and some MFA there. And then, there's the connecting to the VDI. You get another set of credentials there. And if that VPN connection goes down, you're going through that whole 5-minute process again that sometimes involves physical tokens, even still today. I saw some in the last week in the wild. And it seems like, so just talking about security requirements here that people have, that you almost have to rethink what your security requirements are, what they're supposed to be doing. It seems like you could remove whole layers, particularly in authentication and authorization processes here.
I think it's really critical to make sure that we preserve the AAA services that were once provided by a physical token. We need to have those in place. Often you now need to have multiple identity providers. As companies come together or groups come together, or there's a legacy system and a new system, you have to have multiple identity management systems supported, and you need two-factor authentication. So we're not getting away from needing that service, but we can get away from the old kind of build it up piece by piece. Most web applications have this or can integrate with an SSO provider or a two-factor authentication provider. Those controls are there in web applications, well supported by browsers. Let's make it as easy as a user, a worker, signing into a portal-based authentication or signing in and using an extension to get access to applications, and then have that policy applied in the browser, in the cloud, and at the ultimate destination without all the complexity of all these things that come from 20 years ago. Because 20 years ago, there was no other way. SSO was kind of a hack 20 years. Single sign-on was kind of a hack 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Two-factor authentication, there were very few standards for that, and making that work with identity provisioning systems was very difficult. What did we have 20 years ago? Like Radius, maybe SAML was just emerging. So I think we need to look at how things have changed and how all this complexity is now contained, and the hassle of working with that is conserved within the software, and so that administrators and security analysts and end users shouldn't have to deal with it. You should be able to sign in like you do to your bank. Might need 2FA there, like you do to purchase things. You should be able to sign in and do work because the web technology is there, the security technology is there. The only thing that needs to change is, hey, let's allocate budgets a little differently and hopefully gain some benefit and change the way we work a bit. And then maybe in that sense, we need to make sure that the new thing is easy to deploy, easy to manage. I assert that this approach is zero trust access that's easy to own, because ZTNA has been hard to deploy and hard to own for too long.
I think something that I encountered quite a bit. I work with some really large organizations, and I actually one I was working with not too long ago, they described their security strategy as security by obscurity, and they said it in kind of a joking way, but I think what happens is, especially the larger and more siloed an organization is, you have different tools and they just sort of compound on each other over time. So rather than having a holistic security discussion to say, how do we want to handle remote access going forward? What's going to provide the best user experience? What's going to provide the best, secure from a security policy? What's going to meet our needs the best? Just kind of layer things on top of what they've already been doing. And so you end up with this really complicated mess of old school VPN solutions layered on top of, identity solutions layered on top of VDI solutions layered on top of, and on and on. And you end up with this very kind of fragile environment that is hard to navigate and can sometimes be complicated for end users. And I feel like a lot of my role is going into some of these large organizations and getting those groups to talk to each other. So you may have an end user group, you may have a security group, you may have a network group, and sort of getting them to all agree on what is our holistic strategy going forward for end user access, and really taking an organization level decision to simplify that and modernize. And so I don't think one ends up in that place on purpose. It's competing, teams that own different tools with different responsibilities, trying to make something work, and you end up.
Ryan, you make this point really clear that I the question that I often ask is how do you respond to an alert today? And that can, how would you respond if there was a DLP alert, or maybe a bunch of unauthenticated attempts against your VDI system today? And sometimes folks go, we don't know, or sometimes they say we have to get endpoint telemetry, we have to get network telemetry, we have to put all this stuff together. And by asking that question, you
which endpoint, right? There's two endpoints involved, right?
You got it. So the ossification of that system, the layering of that system that Ryan described, you can expose that complexity. And then I just ask, hey, what if it could be this way? What if your alerts were reduced by 70% because you get no unauthenticated requests coming in at all? And then when you did get an alert, visibility was instant. No opening tickets, no reconciling this telemetry, that telemetry, trying to make your NGAV and your network and your star DR thing all work together. What if you could get instant visibility inside of your security console, whether it's a SIEM or you're doing an admin console, and just click play and see what happened? And that changed. And then what I have to do is I just say, let me show you. I got alerts here. Let me click play, and I can just show you what happened. With secure cloud browsing, with Menlo plus Google Cloud, that's how simple it can be, and it doesn't require folks to do anything more than adopt the joint solution, decommission that old stuff, deploy a little bit of software for internal applications, and then they're up and running. And we've seen, in contrast to traditional approaches, we've seen folks roll out thousands of users in single digits of weeks versus a couple hundred users in a pilot for a year, and it only works on internal applications. And then when folks go remote, you're looking for a quick and dirty solution that is often turns into an old SSL VPN, trying to keep it going, or a very complex VDI deployment. You just got it. So I think if we just step back and ask some questions, what if it was dramatically simpler? What if it was more secure? What if it was more cost effective? Let me show you how it works. We can really help make it less worrisome to have a problem in your ASA. Make it less worrisome if there's a vulnerability in a browser that you're wanting to chase down and patch. We just make all of that less worrisome, while also making it easier for administrators and easier on budgets.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like the help desk, service desk use case, troubleshooting is simpler. Administration is simpler. It's seems like it just simplifies a lot of things. As you point out, the number of potential alerts you can have come in. In traditional VDI, as I pointed out, you've got two endpoints. You've got the one receiving, and then the virtual one. The actual physical one that people are sitting in front of. And correlating all that would be a nightmare, along with the VPN logs and everything else.
And we didn't even get into troubleshooting VDI. Looking at session brokers and the actual presentation servers, troubleshooting VDI. Ryan knows more about this than I do. I ran away from that problem and did something else because it's so complex.
We'll definitely say it's a specialized set of skills for sure.
So, we talked a little bit about adapting the old security requirements, kind of getting used to, maybe we can remove some of that stuff. There's an extra set of credentials that don't need to be entered. But what about things that, some of the security benefits here, some of the opportunities that you only have with this kind of solution that the traditional approach to VDI can't really help you with here. Like it seems like a big one is just the flexibility of it and the speed with which you could roll out new applications and things like that. Are there other opportunities here you only have with the newer approach to doing this?
I don't want this to just sound like a pitch. My enthusiasm for this approach is obvious. But the notion that you can get secure access to any application, internal or external, and have integrated defenses is something you just can't do with other solutions. Combining the teams in a way that requires you to do nothing more than simplify how you support access to these applications is I think something that's just not possible. Having the user experience be so straightforward to folks, because it's just like what they do with web pages, SaaS services, consumer shopping applications every day, while at the same time the deployment for the administration team is simple. It's as simple with the joint solution as saying, hey, go to the Chrome store, download the extension, sign in as you sign in, your two-factor authentication, and now the policy just follows you. You'll have the applications you need, and the enterprise will have both the protections that are required and the visibility that is required to keep doing business in a way that's much less risky. And that's why our view is that this is secure application access to modern applications for the modern era, in contrast to the old complex way of stitching a bunch of stuff together, as Ryan described, over decades, and just layering on, as each of those things got more complex to scale out. To scale out, they got more complex. All of that can be contained within a cloud service and be much more cost effective while doing the job in a way that's less risky.
Yeah, and talking about that cost effectiveness, like I was still thinking about like the traditional versus the newer way we're talking about doing it here, and back when I last worked on VDI, we didn't have EDR. Just thinking about, okay, all my laptops need EDR, and all the VMs in my VDI solution also need it. Just all that extra cost and complexity there. But to your point, something you just said, the likelihood, there's a high likelihood if you're moving to a solution like this, it makes sense to run these workloads in the cloud as well. Whatever these applications, these workloads you're giving access to. And maybe let's Ryan, coming to you, talk a little bit about how the impact of that of running things in the cloud versus I imagine if people are getting away from legacy VDI, they're also going to be getting away from running those workloads on-prem. What are some of the advantages there, just moving those workloads to the cloud, even if they are maybe initially more expensive just to run the app? Obviously you've got all those other layers removed, the SSL VPN, endpoint controls on VMs, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, talking about any kind of on-prem to cloud migration, if you're making zero changes, just picking up your environment from on-prem and dropping it in cloud, it's almost certainly going to cost more. You have to be willing to adopt a cloud operational model to really get, because if you're not, you're basically just, if you're going to make zero changes and drop it in cloud, it's basically just an expensive colo. If you're moving to cloud, you need to be adopting cloud operation principles. And so let's say you have a use case where traditional VDI is still required. I help a lot of customers do that. But one of the things I always have to educate them on is power management becomes your best friend in cloud, because you pay for things while they're running. And so it becomes critically important that you take advantage of autoscale policies and things like that, that when you have workloads that are idle, they get suspended, so you're not paying for them. Whereas on premises, you've bought that hardware, you just let it rip 24/7, and that's it. You already paid for the hardware. And so it requires a very different operational model in cloud. Now you can take that a step further and you can say, okay, well, as part of this migration, if we're going to be modernizing some of our applications where now you can just access them via a web browser, don't actually need a local client installed anymore, that's even better. But that's typically the journey I see customers take, where you may be starting and in the very beginning, it's more of a lift and shift kind of approach. And then you go through this, let's take a hard look at how we're doing things and figure out how we can optimize and sort of be prepared for this modernization approach, where we start actually refactoring applications, moving towards a more modern cloud operational model where we're just providing a web browser. And that's sort of the end state. It's very difficult to say, all right, we're moving to cloud, we're gonna do this tomorrow. And so it ends up as this sort of phased approach.
I think that notion of a phased approach is really important, because you can get stuck. If you have to move every application to a web architecture, to a cloud architecture, and then go build it and move every application and every employee all at once, you kind of get stuck. But if you can have a hybrid approach where you have some things in cloud, some things in the current model, you can make web apps available in either model. You can by group or identity move groups over, even pilot use of the new thing, and do it application by application, user by user, and incrementally make the change. That'll build into a really big change over time versus one big thing you really can't get your arms or your budget around. I think that is why combining a private access architecture to web applications that you would not want on the edge of your network and have them be public facing, with moving things to cloud, can really work well. That's really, I think, a benefit of the combined solution, because you can use the new with a legacy web-based system, as you're doing the work, and move things over incrementally. And that's, I think, one really important kind of concept when it comes to moving to a cloud-driven architecture, is to figure out how to move things in increments, not move everything all at once. Those projects usually take too long and end up being very painful. And so I think if you can get an access architecture that works for the old and the new, and that can shift things over in time and help you decommission the old incrementally, that can open up opportunity while reducing risk.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And just, Ryan, you were talking about, rebuilding things for the cloud. And, given that most clouds, including Google Cloud, have POPs all over the world, if you've got folks in London, Singapore, and the Midwest, you probably don't want them all coming to the same location, right? And maybe I've got some regulations maybe impacted by GDPR in one location. Singapore has its own regulations. You can not only reduce, just physical performance, just latency, by having workloads closer to them. You can also maybe address those locale specific regulations and requirements in doing this as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. And not to, I don't want to do too much of a Google commercial here, but you think about the network that was built to support, things like YouTube and Maps and Gmail and things like that on Google Cloud. I mean, customers are able to take advantage of. Google has the largest private fiber network in the world. And so when you're modernizing your applications and taking advantage of that elastic architecture and that global network, and then having a secure front door through a web browser, suddenly, if you're an organization that is a global organization, having consistent good performance with specific security requirements for where users are based becomes a very simple thing to do.
And we've seen this in our migration to a multi-cloud architecture. We have a global multi-cloud architecture as we've moved into Google. We've seen double-digit performance gains in areas, and I think the explanation for that is obvious, especially in particular regions. So it's beneficial that you can get performance gains. I think it's critical that you can get a security benefit that combines secure application access with defenses against phishing attacks or ransomware, malware delivery through the browser. Getting those performance benefits, getting something that users really love to use, while tacitly in the background making sure that the burden of dealing with phishing attacks. We saw these phishing attacks this year going directly against large law firms where the pages are imperceptible, like to an end user. For like nerd reasons of which characters they use in URLs and certificates and how the pages are built. A smart lawyer will look at this page and they'll offer up their credential. I think these were Microsoft credentials they're going after in this case, because the page is imperceptible. You need AI to get on these attacks and get in front of the user because the burden on end users is too great. But burdening end users with something that they don't want to use, that's not going to work either. So the combination of Google and Menlo gives us something that's just great to use for end users, for administrators, and that end users won't spurn because it just works.
It's if I were to sum it up, what you're describing, it's a more defensible platform, right? You're not overburdened with all the different corners and alleyways and angles that you have to defend there. Like it vastly reduces the amount of work you have to do, for monitoring, for, configuring security and for doing detection on this kind of stuff.
I also think it's more defensible to the CIO or the CFO when they ask you, okay, how much are we going to spend on this software, that software, the other software, rebuilding this whole application, duplicating things over time. Like all those questions are easier to answer if you have the benefit of Menlo and Google helping you out.
Yeah. If anybody in the audience has questions, now is the time to get them in as we start to wrap the conversation here. And Andrew and Ryan, just to, I think you guys have done an excellent job with throwing out some practical recommendations here, but maybe just want to repeat some of those and kind of end on the point of, how people can kind of work in this direction. You've both talked about breaking it down into, digestible chunks into, kind of achievable goals here. I don't think anybody wants multi-year projects anymore. And, with Agile, with the cloud, with things like this, you really don't have to. Maybe starting with you, Ryan, leave us with some tips on how the average organization can start this journey.
Yeah, I think don't come in with an all or nothing approach. I think defining a security strategy and then identifying, low-hanging fruit, first movers, then, next that where you're going to provide, maybe it's a little more work, but it's going to provide a tremendous benefit. And then you may end up with some population of users that, they need some published apps, they need VDI for whatever reason. But, that's the biggest mistake I see organizations make is they say, well, if we can't do all of it, we're going to do none of it. And that's how you end up with a mess of layers upon layers of sort of duplicate security solutions that just cause friction. But it starts with defining a strategy and then identifying a phased approach and, being able to look back, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years later and see that progression and reducing that infrastructure consumption by 50%, 70%. I mean, that could be millions of dollars depending on the size of the organization.
I think this is a really good approach. And one question folks can ask themselves is, what's the one thing I want to go do? Back in another era when Wi-Fi was just becoming something that could be used in the enterprise, we often ask this question, and folks would say, "Hey, I want laptops to not have to plug in." Or the really hard question some folks asked, a long time ago now, was, "I want to make a phone call. I want to make a VoIP call over Wi-Fi, and I want that to work." And that would be the goal of their initial project. And a long time ago that was hard to do. Now it just works. I think the question to ask now is something like, hey, I want this application to be available to end users on phones, on tablets, on their device at home, maybe on an unmanaged device. I want this application to just work, and I want to make sure the following list of defenses are applied. And whatever those defenses may be defined in their security strategy, their existing policy. That, by starting with that question, like what is it that they want to just work and be much less risky to support, that can help them understand, hey, is this a good fit or not?
Yeah, almost sounds like some kind of brainstorming session where you establish a vision, like a technology and combined technology and security vision for the future, right?
We actually do this a lot with folks, existing customers who have used us for phishing protection or defense against ransomware attacks. We do workshops where we have this it's like a giant whiteboard kind of slide looking thing. We say, hey, what are the challenges you're seeing with VDI today? And like, are these the challenges you're seeing? How do you want it to be different? And instead of doing the classic, here's a bunch of slides I'm going to make you look at them, we just go and do this workshop. And anyone here could ask to do the same workshop with us, and we throw up a big kind of enterprise architecture of what VDI looks like when you try to secure it and roll it out globally, and we just talk about, hey, are these the problems you're having? And then if the problems they're having aren't a fit, if publishing applications that they've built themselves, if that's their main thing, then maybe there's other things they need to have zero trust applied to. Or maybe it's not a fit. But usually when we put up the big enterprise architecture that looks like kind of a generic version of what you might see from any of the large providers there, they're like, yeah, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem. And we're like, hey, we can help you with these.
And we do have a question here before we wrap. A question about whether or not Menlo has gone through FedRAMP.
Menlo does have FedRAMP, and we are deployed. Our best validation here is our largest customer is the U.S. DoD. So we're deployed in FedRAMP, and if you want to know more about that, we can talk about it in some detail.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Our largest customer is U.S. DoD. Answers the question pretty well there. All right. Great stuff. Thank you both, Ryan and Andrew, for joining me today. Really good conversation. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and with specificity too.
I really enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure, Ryan. Very good to chat with you. Just a good time.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for having me. This was a fun discussion.
And yeah, absolutely. Big thanks to Menlo for sponsoring today's webcast and making it possible. And finally, a big thanks to the audience for joining us. We'll see you next time.